Sometimes a man spends his whole life wondering if he truly belongs anywhere. For Ragnar Vesteinsson, that question would be answered in the most unexpected way. The wealthy Viking had always been mocked for having more gold than glory. At Erik's feast, when farmers spoke of a cursed guard tower, Ragnar bought it on a dare. They laughed at him, thinking he was just another rich fool. But 3 nights later, he found a hidden door beneath the tower's hearth. Below was a stone chamber with a throne and a mysterious pool. When he looked into the water, he saw himself wearing a crown, surrounded by ghostly ancestors he'd never known. What ancient bloodline had he unknowingly claimed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ragnar Vesteinsson had never wanted to be different, yet difference seemed to follow him like a persistent shadow. While other boys his age dreamed of raids and glory, young Ragnar found himself drawn to his father's ledgers, fascinated by the intricate dance of numbers that turned simple goods into prosperity. His father, Vestein the Wise, had built their family's fortune not through sword and shield, but through careful negotiation and shrewd understanding of trade routes that stretched from the frozen fjords to the warm southern kingdoms. The leather-bound trading ledger sat now on Ragnar's oak table, its pages yellowed with age and countless finger marks from both father and son. Each entry told a story, not of battles won, but of deals struck, of trust built across cultural divides, of wealth accumulated through patience rather than plunder. Vestin had been proud of their merchant heritage, often reminding Ragnar that gold earned through wit lasts longer than gold taken by force. Yet even as a boy, Ragnar had sensed something hollow in those words, a defensive quality that suggested his father, too, had felt the weight of being different in a world that celebrated warriors above all. Else the coastal village of Saltvik stretched along a natural harbour where weathered fishing. Boats bobbed beside sleek trading vessels. Stone houses with turf roofs clustered around the central marketplace, their walls built to withstand both winter storms and the occasional raid from less prosperous neighbours. At the village's heart stood Erik's feast hall, a massive timber structure where the community gathered to share news, settle disputes, and celebrate the great events that marked the passage of seasons. Ragnar's own dwelling sat slightly apart from the village centre, larger than most but somehow never quite feeling like home. His father had designed it more like a merchant's compound than a warrior's hall, with counting rooms, storage spaces for valuable goods, and guest quarters for visiting traders. The great room held no weapons on the walls, no shields bearing battle scars, no trophies from distant lands conquered. Instead, maps and trade agreements decorated the space, along with samples of fine craftsmanship from far-off kingdoms. Beautiful, valuable, but somehow lacking the raw authenticity that marked a true Viking home. The village dynamics had shaped Ragnar's entire childhood. Erik Ironhand, who owned the feast hall, treated him with careful respect, the kind reserved for someone whose purse could influence the community's prosperity, but whose sword arm had never been tested. Erik's weathered face, marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, spoke of genuine battles fought and survived. When he looked at Ragnar, there was kindness there, but also a distance that no amount of gold could bridge. Astrid, the wise woman, occupied a unique position in Saltvik's social order. Ancient beyond easy counting, she had served as advisor, healer, and keeper of old knowledge for longer than most could remember. Her small cottage, built against the village's northern wall, overflowed with dried herbs, carved runes, and mysterious artifacts that spoke of powers older than Christianity's recent arrival in their lands. Villagers sought her counsel for everything from difficult births to important decisions, and even the most skeptical warriors showed her deference. She had always watched Ragnar with particular interest, her pale blue eyes seeming to see more than they revealed. But it was Thorvald the Bold who embodied everything Ragnar was not. 3 years younger, but already bearing the scars of 2 successful raids, Thorvald moved through the village with the easy confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. His laughter came readily, his strength was unquestioned, and when he spoke of future conquests, others listened with genuine respect. Thorvald's presence made Ragnar acutely aware of his own soft hands, his merchant's clothes, his reputation for settling disputes with gold rather than steel. The subtle mockery followed Ragnar everywhere, though rarely expressed directly. Conversations would pause when he approached, resuming with slightly forced casualness. Children would play at being great raiders, and sometimes one would volunteer to be the rich merchant, a role that involved cowering, while others acted out heroic rescues. The village women were polite but distant, understanding that while Ragnar could provide well for a family, he could not protect them in the way their culture demanded. These social undercurrents had intensified during the past months as Ragnar approached his 30th year. In their society, a man was expected to have proven himself by now, to have earned his place through deed rather than inheritance. The wealth that should have been a blessing felt increasingly like a barrier, separating him from the life he glimpsed but could never quite grasp. The dreams had started 3 months ago, always the same yet somehow different each time. A voice would call to him from within stone walls, speaking words in an ancient dialect he shouldn't understand but somehow did. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but carried an authority that made his bones resonate with recognition. Sometimes he would wake with tears on his cheeks, grieving for something he had never possessed. Other times, he would rise with a sense of anticipation so intense it made ordinary tasks impossible. The voice always came from the direction of Hagersvelg, the abandoned guard tower that crowned the hill overlooking Saltvik's harbour. Built generations ago to watch for raiders approaching from the sea, it had fallen into disrepair after the kingdom's borders had shifted and made such coastal defences unnecessary. Local farmers had claimed the surrounding land, but the tower itself remained untouched, partly from superstition, partly because none saw value in a crumbling stone structure with no strategic importance. The tower's reputation had grown darker over the years. Animals avoiding the area, strange lights glimpsed from within, the occasional traveller reporting whispered voices carried on the wind. Nothing dramatic enough to spark serious investigation, but sufficient to earn it the label cursed among folk who remembered older ways of seeing the world. Most villagers simply ignored Hagersvelg, treating it as they might a gravestone, something to acknowledge respectfully but not examine too closely. Ragnar's first visit to examine his impulsive purchase had come the morning after Erik's feast. Walking the winding path that led up the hill, he had felt an odd mixture of anxiety and homecoming, as if approaching a place he had left long ago. The tower itself was more impressive than it appeared from the village below. 3 stories of carefully fitted stone, its walls still sound despite years of neglect. The wooden door had swollen with moisture and age, requiring significant effort to force open. Inside, the circular chamber that formed the tower's heart had retained an aura of purpose despite its emptiness. A great stone hearth dominated one wall, its chimney disappearing up into the shadows above. Arrow slits provided views of the surrounding countryside, and a spiral staircase carved into the wall led to the upper levels. But it was the hearth that drew Ragnar's attention most strongly, its blackened stones seeming to watch him with the patient intensity of something waiting for recognition. The upper levels revealed nothing unusual, empty chambers with debris from birds and weather, but nothing to explain the tower's sinister reputation or his own growing obsession. Yet standing in the topmost room, gazing out over the village and harbour spread below, Ragnar had felt something he had never experienced before, a sense of belonging so profound it brought tears to his eyes. For the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. That feeling had sustained him through the village's renewed mockery following news of his purchase. Thorvald had been particularly creative in his commentary, suggesting that Ragnar had finally found accommodations appropriate to his warrior skills. Even Erik had shaken his head with gentle disapproval, wondering aloud why a sensible man would waste good silver on a useless ruin. But Astrid's reaction had been different. When she learned of the purchase, her ancient eyes had sharpened with something that might have been anticipation, or might have been fear. She had studied Ragnar's face for a long moment, then nodded, as if confirming something she had long suspected. "Sometimes," she had said quietly, "a man finds what he needs by reaching for what he wants." The words had stayed with him, their meaning hovering just beyond understanding, like a half-remembered dream. Now, as evening settled over Saltvik and lanterns began to flicker to life in windows throughout the village, Ragnar sat with his father's ledger open before him, unable to concentrate on the careful notations that had once fascinated him. The numbers seemed foreign now, the careful records of profit and loss, feeling disconnected from anything that truly mattered. Outside his window, the tower waited on its hill, a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. The voice in his dreams had grown stronger each night, more insistent, carrying what sounded increasingly like urgency. Tonight, for the first time, Ragnar found himself wondering what would happen if he answered that call. The decision came to Ragnar as he lay sleepless in his bed, listening to the wind howl around the corners of his house. 3 nights had passed since his first visit to the tower, 3 nights of dreams, growing more vivid and insistent. The voice no longer whispered. It called to him with the authority of a king summoning a vassal. Tonight, something deep in his chest told him that ignoring it any longer would be impossible. He rose quietly, gathering his warmest cloak and a lantern filled with seal oil. The village slept soundly around him as he made his way through empty streets toward the hill path. Above, Hagersvelg stood like a stone giant against the starlight, its windows dark as closed eyes. The tower seemed to be waiting, and for the first time since childhood, Ragnar felt no fear of the dark or the unknown. The climb took longer in the darkness, but his feet found the path with surprising certainty, as if he had walked this route countless times before. The tower door, which had resisted his efforts during his daylight visit, swung open at his touch with barely a whisper of sound. Inside, the circular chamber felt different, warmer somehow, and filled with an expectancy that made the air itself seem alive. Ragnar set his lantern on the stone ledge beside the great hearth and began to examine the massive fireplace more carefully than he had during his previous visit. The stones were old, far older than the tower itself, and covered with scratches and marks that might have been accidental damage or might have been something more deliberate. Running his hands along the hearth's base, he felt a slight depression in one of the floor stones, a rectangular outline barely visible in the flickering lantern light. The stone moved when he pressed it, shifting just enough to reveal that it was not mortared in place like its neighbors. Heart pounding with excitement and apprehension, Ragnar worked his fingers around the edges, feeling for purchase. The stone was heavy, requiring all his strength to lift, but it came free with a grinding sound that seemed to echo through the tower's entire structure. Beneath lay darkness, a square opening just large enough for a man to descend, with the top rungs of what appeared to be a stone ladder carved into one wall. Cold air rose from the depths, carrying scents of age and something else. Something that made Ragnar think of deep places where important things had been hidden. The voice came again, clearer now, rising from the darkness below like breath from sleeping lungs. It spoke in the old tongue, words his grandfather might have known, calling him by a name he had never heard but recognized as his own. Without hesitation, Ragnar lowered his lantern into the opening and began his descent. The ladder led down through solid stone for what felt like the height of 2 men. As he descended, Ragnar noticed that the walls around him were not rough-hewn, but smooth, carved with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in his lantern's moving light. The runes were unlike anything he had seen before, older than the Christian crosses, older than the Thor's hammers worn by traditional warriors, older perhaps than memory itself. When his feet touched solid ground, Ragnar found himself in a corridor that stretched away into darkness beyond his lantern's reach. The walls here were definitely carved, covered with spiraling patterns and figures that told stories he could almost understand. Warriors with strange weapons, kings wearing crowns of unfamiliar design, beasts that walked upright like men, all flowing together in a narrative that spoke of times when the world had been different. Most remarkable of all, the runes began to glow as he passed them. Faintly at first, like embers stirring to life, then with increasing brightness until his lantern became almost unnecessary. The light seemed to come from within the stone itself, triggered by his presence in ways that defied any explanation he could imagine. The corridor curved gently downward, following the hill's natural contours, until it opened into a chamber that stopped Ragnar's breath in his throat. Circular like the tower above, but far larger, the room was dominated by a throne, carved from a single piece of black stone. The throne faced a pool of water so still it might have been polished metal, its surface reflecting the soft glow of runes that covered every inch of the chamber's walls. But it was what he saw in the pool that brought Ragnar to his knees in wonder and terror. His own reflection looked back at him, but transformed beyond recognition. The face was his, unmistakably, but wearing an expression of authority and purpose he had never possessed. Upon his head sat a crown of gold and silver, its design matching symbols he now recognized from the corridor walls. Most startling of all, beside his reflection stood other figures, translucent but clearly visible. Men and women in ancient garb who watched him with eyes full of patience and expectation. One of the ghostly figures stepped forward within the pool's vision. An older man whose crown was simpler, but whose bearing spoke of earned rather than inherited authority. He raised his hand in greeting, and when his lips moved, Ragnar heard the voice that had been calling to him in dreams. "Welcome, son of my line. You have found your way home at last." The words echoed through the chamber and through Ragnar's mind, bringing with them a flood of understanding that threatened to overwhelm his carefully ordered world. These were his ancestors, not the merchants and traders his father had claimed as their lineage, but kings and queens of a realm that existed now only in legend and hidden places like this chamber. The old king in the pool continued speaking, his voice carrying across centuries like wind across water. "The blood of Nordvega flows in your veins, though it has been hidden for 3 generations. Your great-grandfather fled when the kingdom fell, choosing exile over death, survival over honor. He was wise. His choice allowed the line to continue, allowed you to be born for this moment." Ragnar's mind reeled as understanding cascaded through him. The merchant heritage he had always felt slightly ashamed of was itself a disguise, a necessary fiction to protect something far more valuable. His family's wealth had not been built through simple trade, but through the careful preservation of resources meant for a future restoration. His father's ledgers chronicled not just profit and loss, but the gradual accumulation of power needed to reclaim a birthright. The vision in the pool shifted, showing him scenes from the past, the fall of Nordvega to rival kingdoms, the desperate flight of the royal family, the careful construction of new identities that would allow them to survive until the time came to reveal themselves. He saw his great-grandfather establishing the first trading routes, his grandfather expanding their influence, his father building the network of contacts and resources that had made their family wealthy and respected throughout the coastal regions. "Why now?" Ragnar whispered to the figures in the pool. "Why is it time?" The old king smiled with sad wisdom. "Because the signs are stirring, young heir. Other bloodlines wake, other claims assert themselves. The ancient sites call to their guardians, and those who would rule must prove their worth or see their heritage claimed by others. You have found the first key, this chamber, this crown, this knowledge of what you truly are. But there are other keys, other tests, other claimants who will not yield easily to your right. As if summoned by his words, a runestone set into the wall beside the throne began to pulse with brighter light. Ragnar approached it slowly, drawn by a compulsion he could not resist. The stone was warm beneath his palm, and the moment his skin made contact, images flooded his mind, visions of other towers, other hidden chambers, other men and women waking to destinies they had never imagined. But there was darkness in the visions too. Rival claimants with their own artifacts and their own certainty of rightful inheritance. Forces that had worked for generations to prevent any restoration of the old bloodlines. Battles that would be fought not just with swords, but with magic and will, and the ancient powers that still moved through the world for those who knew how to call upon them. When the visions faded, Ragnar found himself changed in ways he could feel but not yet understand. The chamber that had seemed magical and mysterious now felt familiar, like returning to a childhood room. The crown in the pool's reflection no longer looked foreign but proper, as natural as his own shadow. Most importantly, the voice that had called to him in dreams was now silent, not because it had abandoned him, but because he no longer needed to be summoned. He was home. The climb back to the tower's main chamber felt like rising from one world into another. As he replaced the stone that concealed the entrance, Ragnar knew that everything in his life had just changed irrevocably. By dawn, he would need to begin the transformation from merchant to king, from outsider to heir, from someone who had always wondered where he belonged to someone who finally knew exactly who he was meant to be. Dawn found Ragnar walking the village streets with a purpose he had never possessed before. The revelation in the tower's hidden chamber had left him fundamentally altered, not just in understanding, but in the way he moved through the world. His steps carried a certainty that drew curious glances from early-rising fishermen preparing their nets. Something had changed about Vestein's son, though none could say exactly what. Astrid's cottage stood at the village's northern edge, where the ancient woman had lived for longer than most could remember. Smoke rose from her chimney despite the early hour, and her door opened before Ragnar could knock. As if she had been expecting him. "So," she said without preamble, her pale blue eyes studying his face with satisfaction. "Oh, you've finally gone below." The words hit Ragnar like a physical blow. "You knew?" Astrid stepped aside to let him enter, her cottage warm with herb-scented air and filled with the accumulated wisdom of decades. Dried plants hung from the rafters, carved runes decorated every surface, and shelves held bottles and boxes whose contents spoke of knowledge, older than the Christian faith that had begun to spread through their lands. "I've been waiting. 30 years for you to discover what you are," she said, settling into her carved chair beside the fire. "Your great-grandfather swore me to secrecy before he died, made me promise to watch over his line until the blood awakened. I've been guardian to a sleeping legacy, keeper of truths that could only be revealed when the time was right." She moved to an ancient chest carved with symbols that matched those Ragnar had seen in the hidden chamber. From within, she withdrew a scroll so old its edges crumbled at her touch. The parchment was covered with intricate drawings, a family tree that stretched back through generations, connecting names he recognized with others that belonged to legend. "The genealogy of the House of Nordvega," Astrid said, spreading the scroll carefully across her table. "Your true inheritance, hidden these many years." Ragnar traced the lines with trembling fingers, following his ancestry back through his father Vestein, his grandfather Thorstein, to the great-grandfather he had never known, Ragnar I, last acknowledged king of Nordvega. The scroll showed how the royal line had continued in secret, each generation preserving their blood, while building the resources that would someday fund a restoration. "Why did they flee?" Ragnar asked, though part of him already knew. "Because sometimes survival requires retreat," Astrid replied. "The kingdom fell to a coalition of rivals who feared Nordvega's growing power. Your great-grandfather could have died fighting as his brothers did, or he could live to ensure the bloodline survived. He chose life, chose exile, chose to let his enemies believe they had won completely. The old woman's fingers traced other branches of the family tree, showing how the royal blood had spread through careful marriages and alliances. But he was not the only one who escaped. Other lines survived, other claims exist. The blood of Nordvega flows in vessels scattered across the northern kingdoms, most unaware of their heritage until the ancient sites begin to wake. She moved to another chest, this one smaller but somehow more significant. From it, she withdrew an object wrapped in silk, a scroll of different design, its surface marked with runes that seemed to pulse within a light. The genealogy was hidden for safety, Astrid explained, but this was hidden for power. The bloodline charter, written in the old tongue, sealed with magic that responds only to true heirs. Your great-grandfather left instructions that it should be given to his descendant when they proved themselves worthy by finding the first key. Ragnar accepted the charter with reverence, feeling the weight of generations in its ancient parchment. The moment his fingers touched the surface, the runes flared with brilliant light and words appeared in the common tongue. Translating themselves for his understanding, the charter spoke of rights and responsibilities that went far beyond simple kingship. The rulers of Nordvega had been more than temporal leaders. They had been guardians of ancient knowledge, keepers of powers that predated the gods themselves. The hidden chamber beneath the tower was only the first of many such sites, each containing artifacts and wisdom meant to guide and test the rightful heir. "The crown you saw in the pool," Astrid said, watching his face as he read, "was not just a symbol but a tool. The bloodline artifacts were created to work together, each one enhancing the others, building power that could reshape kingdoms. But they also carry responsibility, the obligation to use such power wisely, to protect rather than conquer." Ragnar looked up from the charter, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he was learning. "Other claimants? How many? How powerful?" "3 others have awakened so far," Astrid replied grimly. "Each with their own portion of the bloodline, their own artifacts, their own certainty that they are the rightful heir. The ancient sites are stirring throughout the northern kingdoms, responding to multiple claims, waiting to see who will prove themselves worthy of the full inheritance." She moved to her window, gazing out at the tower that crowned the hill above them. "But you have advantages the others lack. This site is one of the most powerful, the crown one of the most significant artifacts. More importantly, you've been raised with wisdom, taught to think beyond simple conquest. Your father's merchant training was not a corruption of your royal heritage, it was preparation for it." The implications began to cascade through Ragnar's understanding. His family's wealth, their network of contacts throughout the trading routes, the respect they had earned through fair dealing, all of it could become the foundation for something far greater than a simple kingdom. He could build not through conquest, but through alliance, not through fear, but through prosperity. "What must I do?" he asked. Astrid smiled, the expression transforming her ancient face. "Learn, grow, become worthy of what you've inherited. The charter will guide you to the other sites, teach you to use the artifacts properly. But remember, knowledge without wisdom is dangerous. Power without purpose is destructive. Your enemies will have artifacts too, but they may not have the patience to use them well." She returned to her chest one final time, withdrawing a small bag of soft leather. "Seeds of the world tree," she explained. "Plant one at each site you claim, water it with your blood, and it will grow into a beacon that marks your territory. More importantly, it will connect the sites, allow you to draw power from all of them when the final confrontation comes." Ragnar accepted the bag with the same reverence he had shown the charter. Each seed felt warm in his palm, pulsing with life that seemed to respond to his touch. "And how long do I have?" "The awakening has begun throughout the north," Astrid said. "Within the year, all claims will be made, all sites discovered. The bloodlines will clash, and only one will emerge with the full inheritance. Use your time wisely. Learn quickly, but learn well." As Ragnar prepared to leave, Astrid caught his arm with surprising strength. "One more thing," she said, her voice carrying new urgency. "Trust carefully. Not everyone who claims to support your cause will prove loyal when the stakes become clear. The merchant's wisdom your father taught you, judge people by their actions, not their words, will serve you better than any crown. Walking back through the village toward his home, Ragnar felt the weight of destiny settling around him like a cloak. The familiar streets looked different now, not just as the place where he had grown up feeling like an outsider, but as the foundation of something far greater. His inheritance was not just a crown and a kingdom, but the chance to build something worthy of the sacrifices his ancestors had made to preserve his bloodline. The transformation had begun, but Ragnar understood now that discovering his heritage was only the first step. The real test would be proving himself worthy of it. That evening, Ragnar returned to the tower with new purpose and understanding. The hidden chamber no longer felt mysterious but familiar, like returning to a room he had known in childhood. The runes along the walls glowed brighter at his approach, and the pool's surface rippled with anticipation as he descended the spiral stairs. The ancestral figures in the water seemed more solid now, their forms gaining definition as his connection to his heritage strengthened. The old king who had first spoken to him stepped forward again, his expression approving. "You have spoken with the keeper," the ghostly figure said, his voice carrying clearly across the water's surface. "Good. Wisdom shared is wisdom doubled. But knowledge alone will not make you worthy of what you seek to claim." The king gestured toward a section of wall that Ragnar had not noticed during his first visit. The stones there seemed different, darker, more roughly cut, as if they had been added later to conceal something. "The crown awaits, but it will not come to you simply because royal blood flows in your veins. You must prove yourself capable of bearing its weight." Ragnar approached the wall, running his hands along the stones until he found one that yielded to pressure. It slid aside with the grinding sound of stone on stone, revealing an alcove just large enough to hold the object within, a crown of gold and silver that matched exactly what he had seen reflected in the pool. But as his fingers closed around the metal, Ragnar gasped at the sudden rush of sensation that flooded through him. The crown was not merely an ornament, but a conduit, a focusing tool that amplified and directed the ancient power that flowed through his bloodline. Images cascaded through his mind. Not just visions of the past, but glimpses of what could be, potential futures that branched out like the limbs of a great tree. He saw himself leading not through conquest, but through inspiration, building alliances that spanned kingdoms, creating prosperity that lifted entire populations. But he also saw darker possibilities, power corrupting, wisdom abandoned for expedience. The same mistakes that had led to Nordviga's original fall. "The crown shows you truth," the old king explained. "Both the glory you could achieve and the failures you must avoid. Every choice you make while wearing it will echo through generations. Are you prepared for such responsibility?" Ragnar placed the crown upon his head, feeling its weight settle not just on his brow, but throughout his entire being. The chamber around him seemed to shift, revealing layers of meaning and connection he had never perceived. The runes on the walls told stories not just of the past, but of the present, showing him the other awakening sites, the other claimants moving toward their own discoveries. Most startling of all, he could sense a presence in the chamber with him, not just the ancestral spirits in the pool, but something more immediate and protective. A guardian that had waited in this place through all the years of exile, maintaining the power and knowledge until a worthy heir returned. The presence spoke without words, communicating directly with his mind in concepts too complex for simple language. It showed him how the crown worked, how to channel his will through its ancient matrix, how to draw upon the accumulated wisdom of all who had worn it before him. More importantly, it began teaching him to see the connections between things, how each decision rippled outward, how power used selfishly weakened itself, how true strength came from service rather than dominion. Under the Guardian's tutelage, Ragnar began to understand that his merchant background was not a weakness to overcome, but a strength to embrace. The skills his father had taught him, negotiation, long-term planning, understanding the needs and motivations of others were exactly the tools a true king needed. Conquest might win territory, but only wisdom could build something lasting. The crown also brought awareness of immediate concerns. Through its connection to the bloodline, Ragnar could sense that other claimants were making discoveries of their own. One somewhere to the north had found an ancient sword that sang with the voices of fallen warriors. Another, in the eastern kingdoms, had awakened a sight of learning, where the old magic was preserved in crystalline form. Each discovery strengthened their claim, while potentially weakening his own, but there were threats closer to home as well. The crown's enhanced perception allowed him to see through the walls of the chamber, up through the tower's stone floors, out into the village where the people he had known all his life were beginning to notice changes in his behavior. Some watched with curiosity, others with concern, and a few with the sharp attention of those who suspected hidden purposes. Thorvald the Bold stood outside the tavern, his warrior's instincts clearly troubled by something he could not identify. The young raider had always been popular in the village, his future seemingly assured through strength and courage. Now he sensed a shift in the natural order, a challenge to assumptions he had never questioned. His hand rested unconsciously on his sword hilt as he stared up at the tower, where strange lights flickered in windows that should have been dark. Even Erik Ironhand seemed uneasy, though his concerns appeared more paternal than hostile. The feast hall owner had watched Ragnar grow from boy to man, had seen him struggle with his place in their warrior society. Now he observed changes that went beyond simple maturation, a new confidence in Ragnar's bearing, an authority that had never been there before. Erik's scarred face showed the worried expression of a man who sensed that events beyond his understanding were beginning to unfold. The crown revealed these observations without judgment, simply showing Ragnar the reality of his situation. His transformation could not remain hidden indefinitely. Soon he would need to make choices about how much to reveal, when to begin asserting his true nature, how to navigate the delicate transition from merchant son to acknowledged heir. Change always brings resistance, the old king in the pool observed, having followed Ragnar's thoughts. Even beneficial change threatens those who profit from existing arrangements. You will need to move carefully, build support gradually, prove your worth through deed before declaring your heritage. The guardian spirit added its own counsel, showing Ragnar images of failed restorations where rightful heirs had moved too quickly, claimed too much too soon, and found themselves isolated and vulnerable. Patience would be crucial, not the patience of delay, but the patience of proper preparation. As the night deepened around him, Ragnar began to understand the magnitude of the task ahead. Reclaiming his heritage would require not just discovering ancient artifacts, but mastering himself, not just asserting his bloodline, but proving himself worthy of what it represented. The crown on his head was both tool and test, offering power proportional to wisdom and responsibility proportional to ambition. When he finally emerged from the chamber, replacing the concealing stone and climbing back to the tower's main level, Ragnar carried with him not just the knowledge of what he was, but the beginning of understanding of what he could become. The transformation from merchant to king had begun in earnest, but he now realized it would be a journey measured not in days or months, but in the careful accumulation of wisdom and the gradual building of strength worthy of his ancestors. Sacrifices. The changes in Ragnar became impossible to ignore as the weeks passed. Where once he had moved through the village with the careful deference of someone seeking acceptance, he now walked with quiet authority that seemed to emanate from his very bones. His shoulders had straightened. His voice carried new weight, and most unsettling of all, he had begun spending long hours in solitary practice with weapons he had never shown interest in before. The transformation had started innocuously enough. Ragnar had visited the village smith, claiming he needed a sword for protection during his increasingly frequent visits to the tower. Bjorn Ironworker, a practical man who judged customers by their coin rather than their reputation, had been happy to provide a well-balanced blade, along with basic instruction in its use. But what should have been clumsy fumbling with an unfamiliar weapon had instead revealed natural skill that surprised everyone, most of all Ragnar himself. The sword felt comfortable in his grip from the first moment, its weight and balance somehow familiar, despite his merchant's soft hands. More remarkably, as he practiced the basic forms Bjorn taught him, memories seemed to flow through the crown's connection, not his own memories, but those of his ancestors. Warriors who had wielded blade and shield with legendary skill, each evening found Ragnar alone in the tower's main chamber, working through increasingly complex sequences of attack and defense. The crown, which he now wore openly within the tower's walls, enhanced his connection to ancestral knowledge, allowing him to learn in weeks what should have taken years. But it was more than simple muscle memory. The ancient kings guided his training, showing him how warfare had evolved, how strategy and tactics could be adapted to current threats. The warrior's saga stone, which he had discovered embedded in the chamber's eastern wall, proved to be the source of this accelerated learning. Unlike the crown, which focused his will and enhanced his perceptions, the stone actively transferred knowledge, pouring centuries of accumulated martial wisdom directly into his mind. Each touch brought new understanding, not just of swordplay but of leadership in battle, of the psychological elements that turned individual fighters into unified forces. The stone's teachings went beyond physical combat. It showed him how true warriors thought, not as mindless berserkers seeking glory, but as protectors calculating risks, as leaders inspiring confidence, as strategists seeing patterns that others missed. The old notion that merchants and warriors were fundamentally different began to crumble, as Ragnar realized that both required the same core skills: reading opponents, planning several moves ahead, understanding when to advance and when to retreat. His rapid improvement could not go unnoticed in a village where everyone knew everyone else's business. Fishermen reported seeing lights in the tower at strange hours, accompanied by sounds that might have been weapons practice. Children claimed to have glimpsed Ragnar moving through combat forms with speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone of his background. The reactions varied across the village's social spectrum. Older residents, those who remembered when strange things were more common in the world, watched with cautious interest. They had lived through enough changes to know that mysterious developments could bring either blessing or curse, and they preferred to wait and see before choosing sides. Younger villagers, particularly those who had grown up mocking Ragnar's merchant ways, found themselves confused by the transformation they were witnessing. Thorvald the Bold, in particular, seemed personally affronted by evidence that his assumptions about Ragnar's nature might have been wrong. The young warrior had built his identity partly on the contrast between his own proven courage and Ragnar's apparent timidity. Now that contrast was blurring in ways that threatened his sense of his own specialness. Erik Ironhand found himself caught between concern and curiosity. As the village's unofficial leader and keeper of its peace, he felt responsible for understanding any changes that might affect the community's stability. Yet he also remembered Ragnar as the thoughtful boy who had often helped settle disputes through careful negotiation rather than force. If that boy was becoming something more dangerous, Erik needed to know. But if he was simply growing into his proper strength, interference might do more harm than good. The tension came to a head on a grey morning when Thorvald approached Ragnar directly, his manner carrying the casual aggression of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. "So, merchant's son," Thorvald said, his voice pitched to carry to the crowd gathering around Erik's hall. "I hear you've been playing at warrior games up in your haunted tower. Perhaps it's time to see what your coin has bought you." The challenge was clear and traditional. In their culture, disputes between men were often settled through combat, with the understanding that skill at arms reflected not just physical ability, but strength of character. Thorvald's words carried the weight of custom, making refusal difficult without loss of face. Ragnar studied the younger man for a long moment, seeing through the crown's enhanced perception not just Thorvald's surface bravado, but the genuine confusion and threatened identity beneath. This was not malice, but fear. Fear that the natural order Thorvald understood was shifting in ways that left him uncertain of his place. "If you wish," Ragnar replied quietly, his calm tone somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. "But understand that things are not always what they appear to be." The crowd that gathered for the impromptu contest included nearly every adult in the village. Combat between community members was serious business, usually reserved for genuine grievances rather than casual displays. The fact that Thorvald had initiated this confrontation suggested deeper currents of unease than most had realized. Erik Ironhand served as judge, laying out the traditional rules: first blood or clear defeat. No weapons beyond sword and shield, the loser to accept the outcome without further challenge. Both men accepted the terms, though Erik's scarred face showed concern about potential consequences, regardless of who won. Thorvald moved with the confident ease of proven experience, his swordwork polished through real combat and regular practice. He had fought in 2 successful raids, had proven himself against opponents who meant to kill him. His technique was solid, his instincts sharp, his willingness to press an attack unquestioned. But as the contest began, it became clear that something fundamental had changed in Ragnar. He moved with fluid precision that spoke of training far beyond anything Bjorn the Smith could have provided. His defensive work was flawless, his counterattacks timed with mathematical precision. His overall strategy clearly several steps ahead of his opponent's thinking. More unsettling still was his demeanor, completely calm, almost detached, as if the outcome had already been determined, and he was simply working through the necessary motions. Where Thorvald fought with the passionate intensity of someone proving himself, Ragnar fought with the patient certainty of someone who had nothing left to prove. The match ended when Ragnar's blade found the gap in Thorvald's guard with surgical precision, drawing first blood from the young warrior's sword arm without causing serious injury. The technique was so perfectly executed that even Thorvald seemed more awed than angry as he acknowledged defeat. But it was the aftermath that truly marked the change in village dynamics. Rather than gloating or claiming victory, Ragnar immediately stepped forward to examine Thorvald's wound, his concern genuine and immediate. "You fought well," he said quietly. "Your technique is sound, your courage unquestioned. But there are things stirring in the world that require us all to become more than we were." The words carried implications that rippled through the watching crowd like stones thrown into still water. This was not the behavior of a merchant's son playing at being a warrior, but of someone who had found authority from a source none of them understood. The victory over Thorvald was impressive, but the grace and wisdom shown afterward suggested depths that made everyone reconsider their assumptions about Ragnar Vesteinsson. The discovery came 3 days after Ragnar's victory over Thorvald, when the crown's enhanced perception revealed a new artifact hidden within the chamber's depths. The bone map of Nordvega emerged from a concealed compartment behind the throne, its surface carved with intricate detail that showed not just geographical features, but the locations of power that had once defined the ancient kingdom. Ragnar studied the map by the light of glowing runes, tracing trade routes and territorial boundaries that had been lost to common knowledge for generations. But more significant were the marked locations, sacred sites, royal treasuries, places where the old magic had been concentrated and preserved. According to the map, the tower chamber where he now stood was only one node in a vast network of connected power, each site waiting for the proper bloodline to awaken its potential. The implications were staggering. His heritage extended far beyond a single crown and throne to encompass an entire infrastructure of ancient knowledge and accumulated resources. But the map also showed that other sites were already stirring, their locations marked with symbols that pulsed with increasing frequency as rival claimants made their own discoveries. That same evening brought news that confirmed his fears. A trader arriving from the northern settlements spoke of strange lights appearing in the ruins of Ironhold, where legend claimed an ancient armory had once stood. More troubling still were reports of a woman claiming royal blood, gathering followers with displays of power that drew both awe and terror from those who witnessed them. The woman, according to the trader's account, called herself Ingrid Wulfsdottir and claimed descent from the Old Kingdom's war leaders. She had apparently discovered weapons that responded to her touch, blades that cut through iron as if it were butter, armor that turned aside any strike. More concerning was her apparent willingness to use violence to establish her claims. Having already declared 3 lesser settlements under her protection through demonstrations of force, she's gathering an army, the trader reported to the crowd in Erik's hall, his voice carrying the excitement of someone bringing momentous news. Veterans of the failed raid on Miklagard, masterless warriors looking for a leader worth following. They say she promises them glory and gold, conquest in the name of restoring the old ways. Ragnar listened from the shadows, his crowned perception allowing him to sense the mixed reactions around him. Some villagers responded with excitement to tales of ancient powers awakening, while others showed fear at the prospect of their peaceful region becoming embroiled in larger conflicts. Most troubling was the grudging admiration he detected in some of the younger men, warriors like Thorvald, who had always dreamed of proving themselves in battles more significant than coastal raids. The next morning brought Astrid to his door, her ancient face grave with concerns that went beyond the immediate threat. 3 more have awakened, she reported without preamble. Ingrid Wulfsdottir in the north, as you've heard, but also Bjorn Bloodaxe in the eastern mountains, and someone calling himself Harold the Wise in the southern fjords. Each has found their heritage, each has begun gathering power. She spread scrolls across Ragnar's table, copies of messages that had reached her through networks of wise women and old believers who still maintained contact across the kingdoms. The reports painted a picture of rapidly escalating conflict as each claimant moved to secure their position. Bjorn has found the crystal caverns, Astrid continued, her finger tracing locations on a map that matched the bone chart Ragnar had discovered. Ancient repositories of knowledge that boost magical abilities beyond normal limits. His followers claim he can see through any deception, predict his enemy's movements days in advance. Harold has awakened the singing stones that can influence men's minds, turn enemies into allies with the right melody. The strategic implications became clear as Ragnar studied the reports. Each claimant had discovered artifacts that complemented their natural inclinations, Ingrid's warlike nature enhanced by weapons of power, Bjorn's scholarly bent amplified by tools of knowledge, Harold's diplomatic skills multiplied by instruments of persuasion. They were not simply competing for the same prize, but developing along different paths that would make each one dangerous in unique ways. The prophecy speaks of a final gathering, Astrid said quietly. When all 4 bloodlines have awakened, when all claims have been made, there will be a convergence. The ancient sites will call to their guardians, and only one will emerge with the full inheritance of Nordvega. But even as external threats mounted, Ragnar faced challenges closer to home. The village's response to his transformation had split along predictable lines, creating tensions that threatened the community's stability. Older residents, led by Erik Ironhand, advocated caution and careful evaluation of the changes they were witnessing. Younger villagers, inspired by Thorvald's grudging respect after their combat, began to see Ragnar as a potential leader who might offer them opportunities for advancement beyond what their coastal settlement could provide. The division crystallized around a practical issue. Raiders from the eastern settlements had been increasingly bold in their attacks on trading vessels, threatening the prosperity that kept Saltvik thriving. Traditional responses had been defensive, relying on Erik's leadership and the village's modest fortifications to deter serious assault. But some now argued for more aggressive action, suggesting that Ragnar's new abilities and growing influence could be used to eliminate the threat permanently. "We could end this," Thorvald argued during a heated discussion in the feast hall. "Not just hide behind our walls, hoping they'll look elsewhere, but actually solve the problem. Ragnar has shown he can fight. Imagine what he could do with a real force behind him." Erik's response carried the weight of hard-earned experience. "Fighting brings more fighting. We defend what we have. We trade fairly. We avoid conflicts that could destroy everything we've built. That's how communities survive." The debate reflected larger questions about Ragnar's role and responsibilities. His merchant background inclined him toward Erik's cautious approach, but the crown's influence and his growing understanding of his heritage suggested that passive defense might not be sufficient in the conflicts ahead. If other claimants were building armies and establishing territories through force, could he afford to remain isolated and reactive? The choice was forced upon him when scouts brought word that a large raiding party was approaching from the east. Not random pirates seeking easy targets, but organized forces flying banners that suggested backing from one of the awakened bloodlines. The attack would come within days, and it would be far beyond anything Saltvik's normal defenses could handle. "Bjorn Bloodaxe's work," Astrid concluded grimly after examining the scouts' reports. "He's testing your strength, trying to force you into open conflict before you're ready. If you defend successfully, you reveal your capabilities. If you fail, he eliminates a rival without having to face you directly." Standing in his tower chamber that night, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of his ancestors, Ragnar faced his first test as a leader. The crown showed him possible futures branching out like paths through a forest, some leading to victory and growth, others to destruction and failure. But all of them required him to choose, finally and irrevocably, between the safety of his old life and the dangers of his true destiny. The revelation came at dawn, on the day the raiders were expected to arrive. Ragnar had spent the night in preparation, consulting with the crown's ancient wisdom about defensive strategies and rallying the village's fighters for what seemed an inevitable battle. He was reviewing positions with Erik when a messenger arrived with news that changed everything. The approaching force had stopped their advance and made camp just beyond the ridge overlooking Saltvik. They were waiting, the messenger reported, but not in the manner of raiders preparing for assault. Instead, they had sent envoys requesting parley under traditional terms of truce. Most unsettling of all, the envoys specifically asked to speak with the heir of Nordvega by name. "They know," Erik said grimly, his scarred face showing the worry of a man who sensed events spiraling beyond his control. "Somehow they know exactly what you are and what you've discovered." Ragnar's enhanced perception, sharpened by weeks of working with the crown, detected something wrong in the very air around them. The knowledge was too specific, too timely. Someone had been feeding information to his enemies. Someone who understood not just his heritage, but the timeline of his discoveries. The truth struck him like a physical blow as he saw Astrid approaching across the village square, her ancient face showing none of the concern that should have marked someone whose community faced immediate threat. Instead, she moved with the purposeful stride of someone whose careful plans were finally reaching fruition. "You look troubled, young king," she said as she drew near, her pale blue eyes holding an expression Ragnar had never seen before. Satisfaction mixed with something that might have been pity. "The raiders know who I am," Ragnar said carefully, studying her face for any reaction. "They know about my heritage, about what I've discovered in the tower. Such specific knowledge would require an informant," Astrid finished for him, her voice carrying none of the shock such an accusation should have prompted. "Someone close to you, someone who has been watching your progress from the beginning." The crown's enhanced perception allowed Ragnar to see what he had missed before, the slight bulge beneath Astrid's robes, where a medallion hung hidden against her chest. The faint glow of runes worked into its metal that marked it as an artifact of significant power. More tellingly, he could now sense the magical connections radiating from her. threads of communication that stretched far beyond the village, toward the force gathered on the ridge. You, he said, the word carrying the weight of betrayal that cut deeper than any blade. You've been reporting to them all along. Astrid smiled, the expression transforming her face into something alien and calculating. Not to them, young fool, to him, to the rightful heir whose claim predates yours by blood and birth. Her hand moved to the hidden medallion, drawing it forth to reveal a seal that matched descriptions from the ancient texts, the mark of Bjorn Bloodaxe, the eastern claimant who had found the crystal caverns. Your great-grandfather was not the only prince to survive Nordvega's fall, she continued, her voice taking on the cadence of someone revealing a truth long held in reserve. Bjorn's line also escaped, also preserved their heritage through generations of careful hiding. But his ancestors chose differently than yours. They maintained the old ways, practiced the ancient arts, prepared for the day when restoration would be possible. The implications cascaded through Ragnar's understanding with sickening clarity. Everything he had believed about his unique heritage, his special destiny, his rightful claim to the throne, all of it had been shaped by someone serving a rival's interests. The wise woman who had guided his discovery, who had provided him with genealogies and artifacts, who had taught him to use his newfound powers. She had been positioning him not for victory, but for defeat. The artifacts you've been given, Astrid said, seeming to enjoy his growing comprehension, were chosen specifically to make you visible to those who know how to look. The crown amplifies your power, but also broadcasts your location to anyone with the proper sensing tools. The warrior's saga stone accelerated your training, but also made you overconfident, convinced you that quick learning could substitute for genuine experience. She gestured toward the tower that had become the center of his new life. Even the chamber itself serves our purposes. Yes, it contains real power, real knowledge, but it's also a trap. The deeper you've delved into its secrets, the more completely you've bound yourself to this single location. Other claimants remain mobile, building their power across multiple sites. You've become the defender of one tower, thinking it makes you strong, while it actually makes you static. Erik Ironhand had been listening with growing anger, his warrior's instincts finally recognizing the threat that had been living among them. How long? He demanded, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt. How long have you been betraying us? Since before Ragnar was born, Astrid replied without shame. I was placed here to watch for signs of awakening in the Vesteinsson line, to guide and shape any heir who emerged. My loyalty has always been to the stronger claimant, the one whose bloodline carries better breeding, and whose preparation has been more complete. The betrayal's scope became clear as Ragnar processed her words. Not just his recent discoveries, but his entire life had been shaped by this deception. His father's merchant business, his family's social position, even his sense of isolation and inadequacy. All of it had been influenced by someone working to ensure he would develop in ways that served another's agenda. Bjorn Bloodaxe offers you a choice. Astrid continued, her tone becoming businesslike. Yield your claim willingly, acknowledge his superior right to the throne, and you may retain a place of honor in the restored kingdom. Your merchant skills would be valuable in administering the trading networks that will fund further expansion. She paused, allowing the weight of the offer to settle. Refuse, and the force gathered beyond the ridge will take what you've discovered by force. Your village will burn, your people will suffer, and you will die, knowing that your stubbornness brought destruction to those who trusted you. The crown on Ragnar's head pulsed with sudden heat, its ancient intelligence responding to the crisis with guidance that cut through confusion and betrayal. Images flowed through his mind, not of defeat and surrender, but of possibilities he had not yet considered. The artifacts Astrid claimed were traps could be tools, if used differently. The tower she described as a prison could become a fortress if properly defended. Most importantly, the loyalty she assumed he lacked might be found in unexpected places. There is a third option, Ragnar said quietly, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised even him. "I can reject both your master's offer and your threats, and find my own path forward." Astrid's confident expression flickered for the first time. "You have no allies, no army, no resources beyond what we have allowed you to gather. Bjorn commands veterans of 12 campaigns, warriors who follow him because they have seen his power and wisdom proven in battle. What do you have to offer against such force?" Ragnar looked around the village square, where a crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the tension they could sense, even without understanding its source. He saw Erik's grim determination, Thorvald's confused loyalty, the faces of people who had known him all his life and were only now beginning to understand what he might become. "I have something your master lacks," Ragnar replied, his hand moving to rest on the crown that had become the symbol of his heritage. "I have a people who chose to follow me, not because they fear my power, but because they believe in what I represent. That may not be enough to guarantee victory, but it's enough to guarantee that any victory your master wins will cost him more than he expects to pay." The medallion around Astrid's neck flared with light as she activated its communication properties, sending word to the waiting forces that negotiation had failed. "So be it," she said, her ancient face hardening into an expression of cold resolve. "You have chosen the path of honor over the path of wisdom. We shall see which serves you better when the battle is joined." As she turned to leave, her parting words carried the weight of prophecy. "Remember, young king, that the crown you wear was designed to be worn by one worthy of its power. If you prove unworthy in the testing that comes, it will abandon you as surely as wisdom abandons those who reject sound counsel." Standing in the village square as the woman who had shaped his destiny walked away to join his enemies, Ragnar felt the weight of true kingship settle upon him for the first time. Not the ceremonial authority of inherited position, but the terrible responsibility of making choices that would determine the fate of everyone who looked to him for leadership. The hours following Astrid's betrayal moved, with the terrible clarity that comes when all illusions have been stripped away. Ragnar stood in his tower chamber, no longer seeing it as a sanctuary, but understanding it properly for the first time, not a trap as Astrid had claimed, but a test. The ancient kings who had built this place had designed it to reveal truth about those who would claim their heritage. As he studied the bone map with fresh eyes, Ragnar began to see patterns he had missed before. The tower's location was not arbitrary, but carefully chosen, positioned at the convergence of several ley lines that channeled the old power across the landscape. More importantly, it sat at the geographic center of what had once been Nordvega's heartland, equidistant from the other major sites that dotted the ancient kingdom. "It was never meant to be a single stronghold," he murmured to the ancestral spirits that flickered in the pool's reflection. "It was designed to be a hub, a place where power could be gathered from multiple sources and coordinated across great distances." The old king smiled with approval. "Now you begin to understand. Your merchant's mind sees what warrior kings often miss. The true strength comes not from concentration, but from connection. Not from holding one position, but from linking many." The revelation changed everything about Ragnar's strategic thinking. Where he had been focusing on defending the tower against direct assault, he now saw possibilities for using its unique properties to project force far beyond its physical boundaries. The chamber's artifacts were not just tools for personal enhancement, but components of a larger system that could coordinate actions across the entire network of ancient sites. But understanding the tower's potential was only the first step. To use it effectively, he would need allies who could serve as his agents at the other locations, and time was running short. The force gathered beyond the ridge would not wait indefinitely for his response to their ultimatum. Erik arrived as the sun reached its zenith, his weathered face showing the strain of a man forced to prepare for battle against overwhelming odds. "The count is 230, he reported grimly. Professional warriors, well-equipped, moving with the discipline of veterans. Our people are brave, but most have never faced anything like this." How many can we field? Ragnar asked, though he suspected the answer would be discouraging. 43 with real fighting experience, Erik replied. Perhaps 60 more if we count every man and woman willing to hold a weapon. Against trained raiders, in open battle. He shrugged, the gesture more eloquent than words. But Ragnar was already moving beyond conventional tactical thinking. The crown's enhanced perception allowed him to see the magical currents that flowed through the area, the residual power that had accumulated in certain locations over generations of use. More importantly, he could sense the other, artifacts scattered throughout the region, tools that had been waiting for someone with the proper bloodline to awaken their potential. We're not going to fight them in open battle, he said, his voice carrying a certainty that made Erik look up with sharp attention. We're going to show them what they're really trying to claim, and let them decide if it's worth the price they'll have to pay. The afternoon brought a discovery that changed the entire dynamic of the approaching conflict. While exploring the tower's upper levels with fresh perspective, Ragnar found a hidden compartment that contained an artifact unlike any he had encountered before. The Shield of True Kings, its surface covered with runes that pulsed with inner light as his fingers traced their intricate patterns. The shield was not merely defensive but revelatory, designed to manifest the true nature of whoever wielded it. As Ragnar lifted it, the artifact began to resonate with the crown's power, creating a harmonious vibration that seemed to strengthen both items beyond their individual capabilities. But more importantly, the shield carried with it a flood of knowledge about the other sites in the ancient network, showing him exactly how to establish connections across the vast distances that separated them. The process required more than simple magical activation. It demanded personal presence at each location, a physical touching of stone to stone, blood to blood, that would bind the sites together under his authority. But once established, those connections would allow him to draw upon the accumulated power of the entire network, making him far stronger than any single claimant operating from an isolated base. The others don't know, the old king confirmed when Ragnar shared his understanding. They see the sites as individual treasures to be claimed rather than components of a greater whole. Bjorn has focused on the crystal caverns, believing that enhanced knowledge is the key to victory. Ingrid builds her strength through weapons and warriors. Harold seeks to control minds and hearts through persuasion, but none of them understand the true architecture of power that our ancestors created, Ragnar said, pieces of the larger puzzle finally fitting together. They're fighting for individual advantages, while I can potentially access the entire system. The challenge was time. Visiting even the nearest sites would require days of travel, and the enemy force would not wait indefinitely for his response. But as Ragnar studied the network map more carefully, he began to see a solution that drew upon his merchant's understanding of logistics and coordination. He didn't need to visit every site personally. He needed to send representatives who could carry his authority and establish the initial connections. The shield's power could be divided among trusted agents, allowing them to act in his name at distant locations, while he maintained central coordination from the tower. The question was finding people worthy of such trust, individuals whose loyalty was beyond question and whose capabilities matched the magnitude of the task. As if summoned by his need, Erik appeared in the chamber accompanied by Thorvald and 3 other villagers whose courage and competence had been proven through years of shared struggle. "We've been talking," Erik said without preamble, "about what you said, about showing them what they're trying to claim. Some of us think we understand what you mean, and we want to be part of whatever you're planning." Thorvald stepped forward, his young face serious with newfound responsibility. "I was wrong about you," he said simply. "Wrong about what strength means. Wrong about what leadership requires. If you'll have me, I want to help you prove that our way is better than theirs." The shield pulsed with warmth as Ragnar explained what he needed. Trusted agents who could travel to specific sites, individuals willing to risk everything, on the belief that cooperation could triumph over conquest. The artifact itself would guide them, showing them how to establish the connections that would link the network under his authority. It's dangerous, he warned them. The other claimants have agents searching for the same sites. You could find yourself facing enemies who are more experienced, better equipped, and completely ruthless in pursuing their goals. More dangerous than staying here to face an army? Thorvald asked with a grin that reminded Ragnar why the young warrior had always been popular in the village. At least this way we're doing something instead of just waiting for them to come to us. The plan that emerged over the next few hours drew upon every skill Ragnar had learned as his father's son. The agents would travel in pairs, using the merchant network's established routes and safe houses to move quickly and avoid detection. Each pair would carry one of the shield's fractional powers, allowing them to establish the initial connections that would begin linking the sites together. But success would require perfect timing. The agents needed to reach their destinations and complete the bonding rituals before Bjorn's forces realized what was happening and moved to intercept them. More critically, Ragnar would need to maintain the appearance of weakness and isolation until the network was fully activated, giving his enemies no reason to alter their plans. As evening approached and the agents prepared for departure, Ragnar made one final preparation in the tower chamber. The ancient kings had left one more gift, a communication crystal that could carry messages across any distance to those who wore fragments of the shield's power. Through it, he could coordinate the network's activation and ensure that all connections were established simultaneously. "Remember," he told the departing agents as they gathered in the twilight, "you're not just carrying my authority, but representing something larger than any individual claim to power. Show them what Nordvega could become under leadership that values cooperation over conquest, and let that vision do half the fighting for you." Erik, who would remain to help coordinate the tower's defense, clasped Ragnar's shoulder with rough affection. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly. This is exactly the kind of patient, careful planning he was famous for, but with something he never had, the willingness to risk everything when the stakes are high enough. As the agents disappeared into the darkness, carrying with them Ragnar's hopes for a bloodless resolution to the crisis, he climbed to the tower's highest level to wait for dawn and whatever challenges it would bring. The crown on his head hummed with anticipation. The shield in his hands pulsed with gathering power. And for the first time since Astrid's betrayal, he felt genuine hope that wisdom might yet triumph over force. The test that had begun with his impulsive purchase of a cursed tower was reaching its climax, and Ragnar finally understood that he had never been fighting for a crown or a kingdom, but for the right to define what leadership could mean in a world too often ruled by those who mistook power for strength. Dawn broke grey and cold over Saltvik as Bjorn Bloodaxe's army crested the ridge, overlooking the village. Ragnar watched from the tower's highest window as the force deployed with professional precision. No wild raiders these, but disciplined warriors moving with the coordination that spoke of countless battles fought together. At their head rode a figure that commanded attention even at distance. Bjorn himself was a giant of a man, his presence radiating the kind of authority that came not from birth but from proven leadership in the crucible of combat. The crystal crown upon his head caught the morning light, its faceted surface blazing with inner fire that spoke of power drawn from deep places where ancient knowledge slept. "He's impressive," Erik observed grimly from beside Ragnar, his scarred face studying their enemy's deployment. "I can see why warriors would follow him. There's something about the way he carries himself, like he's never doubted his own worth." But Ragnar's enhanced perception, sharpened by the crown and shield working in harmony, allowed him to see beyond Bjorn's imposing exterior to the man beneath. The Eastern claimant moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to victory, but there was also rigidity in his bearing, an inflexibility that suggested he had succeeded by overwhelming opposition rather than outthinking it. The communication crystal at Ragnar's belt pulsed with gentle warmth, signaling that his agents were in position at their assigned sites. Thorvald had reached the Singing Stones, Erik's son Magnus had found the Iron Grove, and the others had successfully located their targets across the ancient network. All waited for his signal to begin the binding rituals that would link the sites under his authority. But first, he had to deal with the immediate threat approaching his village. Bjorn's herald advanced under a flag of truce, his voice carrying clearly across the distance as he delivered terms that were more ultimatum than negotiation. Bjorn Bloodaxe, rightful heir to the throne of Nordvega, offers final terms to the pretender who styles himself king. Yield your stolen artifacts, acknowledge the superior claim, and your people will be spared the consequences of your foolish resistance. From his position atop the tower, Ragnar could sense the fear that rippled through the village below. His people were brave, but they understood the odds they faced. 200 experienced warriors against their small community. The outcome of conventional battle was never in doubt. What answer shall I give? The herald called, when no immediate response came. Ragnar stepped to the tower's edge, where his voice would carry clearly to both armies. Tell your master that the heir of Nordvega accepts his challenge, but not on the terms he offers. If he truly believes his claim is superior, let him prove it through the old ways, by the judgment of the artifacts themselves. A murmur rippled through both forces as the implications became clear. The ancient laws spoke of trial by combat between claimants, but not simple physical battle, a testing of worthiness through the artifact's own recognition of rightful authority. Bjorn himself rode forward, his massive presence even more imposing at closer range. You propose single combat merchant spawn? Very well. But know that I have proven my worth in a dozen kingdoms, claimed my heritage through strength of arm and clarity of purpose. Your soft hands and peaceful village have taught you nothing of what kingship truly requires. The Eastern claimant dismounted and drew his sword, not the simple blade of a common warrior, but an artifact that sang with power as it cleared its sheath. The Sword of Storms, according to legend, a weapon that could call down lightning and wind to serve its wielder's will. As Bjorn raised it, clouds began to gather overhead with unnatural speed, and the air itself seemed to crackle with barely contained energy. But as the two men faced each other in the space between village and army, something unexpected happened. The artifacts each carried began to resonate, not with conflict but with recognition, their ancient intelligences communicating in ways that transcended their current wielder's intentions. Ragnar felt the crown's consciousness expand, reaching out to touch the crystal crown that Bjorn wore, sharing information and testing compatibility. At the same time, his shield pulsed with energy that seemed to respond to something within Bjorn's sword, as if the weapons recognized each other from some long-forgotten forging. Impossible, Bjorn breathed, his confidence wavering for the first time as he felt his own artifacts responding to Ragnar's presence in ways that defied his understanding. The bloodlines cannot be. The revelation struck both men simultaneously as their artifacts revealed a truth that neither had suspected. They were not rival claimants from competing family lines, but distant cousins, both descended from the same royal house through different branches. The artifacts had been created to work together, each one incomplete without the others, designed by ancestors who had anticipated exactly this moment. Brothers in blood, Ragnar said softly, understanding flooding through him as the crown showed him genealogies that went deeper than either man had known. The kingdom was never meant to be ruled by one alone. It was designed for shared leadership, multiple heirs working in harmony. The Sword of Storms in Bjorn's hands began to pulse with different energy, its storm-calling power shifting from destructive potential to something more complex and nuanced. Above them, the gathering clouds swirled not with the promise of lightning, but with the gentler power of life-giving rain. Around them, both armies watched in fascination as the expected battle transformed into something unprecedented. Not the violent clash of rival claimants, but the recognition of kinship that neither had expected to find. The moment of recognition between the cousins was shattered by a sound that chilled the blood of every person present. the war horn of Ingrid Wolfsdotter echoing across the hills from the north. The woman who had been gathering an army of masterless warriors had arrived with perfect timing to catch both claimants in the open, their forces deployed for battle against each other rather than prepared for a three-way conflict. She planned this, Bjorn said grimly, his warrior's instincts immediately grasping the tactical situation. Let us weaken each other, then strike when we're vulnerable. Ragnar's enhanced perception allowed him to see the approaching force, smaller than Bjorn's army, but moving with the predatory efficiency of wolves hunting in a pack. At their head rode Ingrid herself, her artifact weapons gleaming with unnatural light, her presence radiating the kind of savage confidence that came from viewing all opposition as prey to be consumed. But even as the immediate threat materialized, Ragnar felt the communication crystal pulse with urgent energy. His agents had completed their missions, successfully establishing connections at each of the ancient sites. The network was ready for activation, waiting only for his command to link the scattered nodes of power under unified control. The choice that faced him was stark and immediate. He could activate the network now, drawing upon its vast power to face Ingrid's assault, but doing so would leave Bjorn and his forces excluded from the alliance, potentially creating a permanent rift between the cousin claimants. Or he could trust in the fragile recognition that had just emerged between them, risking everything on the hope that shared heritage would prove stronger than individual ambition. The heart of Nordvega, Bjorn said suddenly, his eyes widening as understanding struck him. It's not just a legend. There really is a final artifact that chooses between claimants. Ragnar felt the crown's consciousness stir with confirmation. Deep beneath the tower, in a chamber that could only be accessed when multiple artifacts worked in harmony, lay the ultimate test of worthiness, a crystalline heart that contained the concentrated essence of the ancient kingdom's power. But reaching it would require cooperation between the claimants, a unity of purpose that had seemed impossible until this moment. Together, Ragnar said, extending his hand to his cousin as Ingrid's forces closed the distance. Whatever we were before, whatever claims we thought we held individually, right now we're the only chance this kingdom has to be restored properly. Bjorn clasped the offered hand without hesitation, his own artifacts responding to the contact with flares of sympathetic energy. Together, he agreed, but we need to reach the heart before she does, or all our noble intentions won't matter against her willingness to burn everything down to claim victory. The two men raced toward the tower as battle erupted around them. Ingrid's warriors struck with the fury of those who fought for plunder rather than principle, their assault designed to scatter and demoralize rather than capture territory. Behind them rode their leader, her artifact weapons cutting through opposition like a scythe through grain, her war cry carrying promises of destruction for any who stood against her claim. Inside the tower, Ragnar and Bjorn descended to the hidden chamber where the ancestral spirits waited with expressions of approval and anticipation. The pool's surface rippled with excitement as both men approached, their combined artifacts creating harmonics that awakened responses throughout the chamber. Two of royal blood, improven in trial, united in purpose, the old king intoned from within the water's reflection. The way opens for those who would serve rather than be served. The chamber's floor began to shift, revealing stairs that descended deeper than the original construction, down to levels that had been sealed since the kingdom's founding. Here, in the deepest vault, lay the heart of Nordvega, a crystal the size of a man's fist that pulsed with inner light like a captured star. But the artifact was not simply waiting to be claimed. As both men approached, it began to project visions of possible futures, testing their intentions and measuring their worthiness. They saw themselves ruling together, their different strengths complementing each other, Bjorn's strategic brilliance balanced by Ragnar's diplomatic wisdom, the warrior's decisive leadership tempered by the merchant's long-term thinking. But they also saw the consequences of failure. Ingrid's victory would mean the reduction of Nordvega to a simple pirate kingdom, its ancient wisdom lost, its people enslaved to serve one woman's appetite for conquest. The network of sites would be corrupted, their power turned toward destruction rather than creation. Choose, the heart seemed to whisper directly into their minds. Not between yourselves, but between service and selfishness. Between building and burning, between the wisdom of your ancestors and the hunger of those who would devour everything in pursuit of empty glory. Above them, the sounds of battle grew louder as Ingrid's forces overwhelmed the combined armies, her personal power proving too great for conventional resistance. Time was running out, and the choice could no longer be delayed. Both men reached for the heart simultaneously, their hands meeting on its crystal surface. As light exploded through the chamber and the ancient network finally awakened to its full potential, the light that blazed from the heart of Nordvega, as both cousins claimed it together, was visible for miles across the northern kingdoms. It rose through the tower's stone floors, burst from every window, and painted the sky with colors that spoke of ancient powers awakening after generations of slumber. The network that Ragnar's agents had so carefully prepared responded to the activation, linking sites across vast distances in a web of power that transformed the very nature of the conflict above. Ingrid Volsdottir, who had been cutting through combined resistance with the ease of a master warrior facing novices, suddenly found herself facing something unprecedented. The power that had made her artifacts so devastating began to falter as the true royal network asserted its authority, revealing her weapons to be crude imitations rather than genuine relics of the ancient kingdom. But more significantly, the awakening network began to affect the minds and hearts of her followers. The masterless warriors who had flocked to her banner because she promised them easy victory and rich plunder found themselves remembering older loyalties, deeper purposes that transcended simple greed. The ancient power that flowed through the reconnected sites carried with it the wisdom and vision of Nordvega's founders, offering a glimpse of what the kingdom could become under worthy leadership. Many of Ingrid's fighters simply laid down their arms, their bloodlust dissolved by exposure to something nobler than conquest for its own sake. Others looked around in confusion, as if awakening from a dream they could no longer remember clearly. Only Ingrid herself seemed immune to the network's influence. Her will, too, focused on personal ambition, to be swayed by appeals to higher purpose. When Ragnar and Bjorn emerged from the tower, they carried with them not just the heart of Nordvega, but a transformed understanding of what their heritage truly meant. The crown of unity that now rested on Ragnar's brow was no longer the simple royal circlet he had first discovered, but an artifact that had evolved through their shared claiming, incorporating elements from both cousins' journeys to become something greater than either could have achieved alone. The crown's transformation reflected the deeper change in how the kingdom would be governed. Where the ancient rulers had held absolute power as individual monarchs, the restored Nordvega would be led by a council of proven heirs, each bringing their own strengths while being held accountable by the others. Bjorn's strategic brilliance would guide military matters. Ragnar's diplomatic wisdom would shape trade and internal governance, and space would be left for other worthy claimants who might emerge in the future. Ingrid faced them across the battlefield that had been transformed from a site of destruction into a place of revelation. Her artifact weapons still gleamed with power, but it was the cold light of metal rather than the warm glow of true royal relics. She had strength enough to continue the fight, but she no longer had followers willing to die for a cause that had been revealed as hollow. "You would deny me my birthright," she demanded, her voice carrying across the sudden silence that had fallen over the gathered forces. "We deny no one their true heritage," Ragnar replied, his words carrying the authority of someone who spoke for legitimate power rather than merely claiming it. "But leadership is not a birthright to be seized, it's a responsibility to be earned. The artifacts you carry are powerful, but they respond to will rather than wisdom, to hunger rather than service." Bjorn stepped forward, his own presence now radiating the confident authority of someone who had found his proper place. "Join us," he offered simply. "Help us build something worthy of our ancestors, rather than fighting over the ruins of what they left behind. Your strength could serve the kingdom's restoration instead of its destruction." For a moment, it seemed that Ingrid might accept the offer. The network's influence touched even her, showing her visions of what she could accomplish as part of something larger than her own ambitions. But the hunger that had driven her to claim power through violence proved stronger than the wisdom that urged cooperation. "I will not be anyone's subordinate," she snarled, raising her weapons for a final assault. The battle that followed was brief but decisive. Ingrid's individual power, impressive as it was, could not stand against the coordinated authority of the awakened network. Her weapons shattered against defenses that drew strength from every connected site. Her attacks were turned aside by shields that had the weight of ancient wisdom behind them. And in the end she stood alone and defeated, while the promise of restored Nordvega blazed around her. But even in defeat, she was offered mercy. The cousins who had claimed joint leadership of the kingdom understood that true strength came not from destroying enemies, but from transforming them into allies. Ingrid was given the choice that Bjorn had once offered Ragnar: serve the restored kingdom in a role that matched her abilities, or face exile from the lands that had been shaped by powers greater than any individual will. In the weeks that followed, Saltvik became the center of a transformation that spread throughout the northern kingdoms. The merchant networks that Ragnar's family had built over generations became the foundation for trade alliances that brought prosperity to regions that had known only conflict. Bjorn's military expertise helped establish defenses that protected the growing kingdom without threatening its neighbors. Most importantly, the example they set of leadership earned rather than seized, of power shared rather than hoarded, began to influence other rulers who had been watching the restoration with interest. Erik Ironhand, whose loyalty had been tested by fire and proven unbreakable, found himself appointed as the first chancellor of the restored kingdom, his practical wisdom serving as a bridge between the ancient powers and modern needs. Thorvald, whose courage in carrying out the network connection had been crucial to their success, became the leader of a new kind of warrior band, protectors who served the kingdom's growth rather than their own glory. Even Astrid, whose betrayal had nearly brought disaster, was eventually forgiven and given a role that suited her abilities, keeper of historical knowledge and teacher of the old ways to those who would guide the kingdom's future. Her punishment was not exile or imprisonment, but the responsibility of ensuring that the mistakes she had made in service to false ambition would not be repeated by others. Standing in the tower chamber where his journey had begun, Ragnar reflected on how completely his understanding of belonging had been transformed. He had started as a wealthy man who felt like an outsider in his own community, unsure of his place or purpose. Now he was a king who understood that true belonging came not from being accepted by others, but from accepting responsibility for others' welfare. The pool that had first shown him his heritage now reflected a different vision, not just of himself wearing a crown, but of a kingdom where leadership served its people rather than the other way around. The voice that had called to him from stone walls had been answered, but the conversation would continue for generations as worthy heirs emerged to carry forward the vision of what Nordvega could become. The merchant's son who had bought a cursed tower on a dare had indeed inherited a prophecy, but not the simple tale of royal restoration he had first imagined. Instead, he had discovered that the greatest inheritance was not power over others, but the wisdom to use whatever strength he possessed in service of something larger than himself.